Hello YouTube. First of all, a couple of rants if I may. The first one is that this is the third time I've recorded this video. The first time I recorded it, I realised my microphone wasn't plugged in after playing back the file. So I plugged it in, and then the second time I recorded it, I hadn't realised that because my microphone had been unplugged the first time, Windows had changed the input source. So it still never recorded properly. So this is my third attempt. Hopefully this is going to work. My second rant, which is more of a warning than a rant really, has to do with the fact that Square have decided to put a claim on my latest Final Fantasy VIII video. Now what this means is that any AdSense revenue generated by this video will be going directly to them. Now I just want to point out that money was not the reason I made this video. As a matter of fact, these lore videos that I make are the worst performing videos in terms of ad revenue, mainly because of the amount of time it takes to make them. This particular 5-minute video took about 5 hours and is currently sitting on about 1,000 views, which would have equated to a couple of dollars. So I don't make these videos for that reason. I make them for you guys because I want to make sure that you have some good content. However, Square have claimed this, which means that that little bit of revenue will be going directly to them, which in my view is a little bit rude, especially because this video should have been covered under fair use, and also their own material usage policies does give YouTubers and Twitch streamers permission to use their game footage. But anyway, this makes me think, and this is where the warning comes in, that perhaps they are changing their policies for whatever reason because of the upcoming Final Fantasy VIII Remaster. Now, this particular claim isn't something I'm too concerned about, but going forward, if they are going to be claiming videos on Final Fantasy VIII, then that is a potential concern for those of us that upload Final Fantasy VIII content on YouTube. Especially because if they start putting copyright strikes out and not just claims, then that could have a negative effect, because if you have 3 strikes, your YouTube channel is permanently closed. So I was of course hoping to do a walkthrough on the Final Fantasy VIII Remaster. I think we now need to check with Square whether that's going to be a viable thing to do. But over the years, I know that there have been many people, because they've told me themselves, who have actually gone ahead and purchased specific Final Fantasy games because of actually watching the content that I've put out on my YouTube channel. And I've always been happy to support Square in this way because I love the Final Fantasy franchise. I want to see it thrive. So when, you know, they pull stunts like this, I find it a little bit frustrating. Anyway, I have put a dispute out for this claim. So hopefully, you know, YouTube will lift it, but by the time they do, of course, this video will be dead anyway. Nobody will be watching it, and Square would have sucked out any life from it by that point. Right, so the bulk of today's video is going to be this article on thegamer.com that I want to examine, and this was written by Scott Baird. I will leave a link to it in the video description. It was posted yesterday, and it's talking about something that I've already addressed on my channel, but is worth, you know, going into further detail on, and that is why has Final Fantasy VIII been neglected by Square for so long? And the title of this article is, why did Final Fantasy VIII take so long to remaster? Now Scott's going to give various reasons, various opinions as to why he thinks this was the case. Some I agree with, some I think are stretching at the definition of the word why here. But I'm going to look into those with you, and I would encourage you to check out this article and share your thoughts on it in the comments below. So the first thing that Scott talks about is perhaps the one thing that I can get on board with him, and that is the unfair negative response to the game. This is why Square perhaps have neglected it for so long. The one thing I would disagree with Scott on is the usage of this word unfair. I don't believe that some of the negative criticism that Final Fantasy VIII has received over the years has been particularly unfair. And I say that as a fan of the game. I love Final Fantasy VIII. It is not my favourite of the Final Fantasy franchise. It's not even my favourite of the PlayStation era of games. But even so, as a fan of the game, I do recognise that it had its problems. And I can already anticipate, because this happens on pretty much every Final Fantasy VIII video I upload, that a lot of you will be telling me how rubbish this game is, how much you hate it. That's absolutely fine. For me personally, I do enjoy it. However, I do recognise it has issues. Now, interestingly, the number one issue that Scott goes to here is the fact that it was a sequel to Final Fantasy VII, but not in the traditional sense of the word, and this confused people. They were perhaps gamers were expecting a direct sequel to Final Fantasy VII that continued to advance the story and characters of that game, and never received that. Well, I don't think I agree with that. That was never an issue that I was aware of when Final Fantasy VIII was released. Final Fantasy traditionally, of course, has never done sequels in that fashion, at least not by the point of the release of Final Fantasy VIII, anyhow. And you could argue that Final Fantasy VII was so popular it introduced a whole new audience to the franchise who perhaps were expecting number 8 to be a direct sequel. But even so, even if that was the case, I don't see how that would have had a long-term effect on Square's view of the game, because we all know now how Final Fantasy works as a franchise. So even if it did affect some negative reaction to the game, it would have only been for that initial release, not going forward. But then Scott does mention the fact that Final Fantasy VIII has also faced a lot of criticism over the years for various aspects of its gameplay and story. This is where I agree. In particular, I think one of the main reasons that Final Fantasy VIII has proved to be divisive is because of the junctioning system. And, the junctioning system, in one sense, was a very powerful and a very good system because it gave a wealth of customization to the player, and I'm not disputing that at all. If you put the time into the junctioning system, you could, invest hours into the grinding of magics and stuff and really overpower your party, which is a staple, really, of any Japanese role-playing game. You put in the time, you reap the rewards, and the junctioning system absolutely provided that. The problem was some of the negative aspects of it perhaps outweighed those positives. The whole concept of drawing magic was something that wasn't particularly well received. It was an unnecessary grind, which was particularly boring for many people. Having to draw out 100 of each magic from various monsters and stuff, especially, when you could only draw for some of the powerful magics 1 or 2 at a time, if you was even successful in drawing, could make a draw for just one set of 100 magics last several hours. A lot of people were against that. But then when you did draw magics, you were encouraged not to cast those magics, because by junctioning them to your stats would actually weaken if you reduced the number of magics that you were holding. That was just a poor system. It shouldn't have been like that. If you're going to be drawing magic and, equipping magic, you should be able to cast that magic without fear of negatively affecting your party's stats. So that was a core problem with the junctioning system. And on top of that, the whole system itself, for those of us that have played Final Fantasy VIII many times and know the game inside out, we can sometimes perhaps take for granted, but the system itself was incredibly confusing. And especially for new players, just do a YouTube search on Final Fantasy VIII junctioning and you'll just see a wealth of posts on forums, on GameFAQs, on Reddit, of people that are just utterly confused with the junctioning system, new players in particular. The player has to go through a whole bunch of just boring tutorials and really pay attention to those tutorials to have any idea as to how to use the system. And for those people, that are coming to the Final Fantasy franchise for the first time with Final Fantasy VIII, they could easily be put off by the junctioning system, and that could then tarnish their view of the franchise as a whole. And I think Square perhaps were aware of that, and that is, in my view, why they have not paid a whole lot of attention to Final Fantasy VIII since its initial release. Next up, Scott talks about the anniversary snub, as he calls it here, and this is a valid criticism actually of Square. The fact that February the 11th this year we had the 20th anniversary of the game's release, but you wouldn't have known that if you followed Square Enix's social media, because they never commented on the fact at all in any way, shape or form. And this was hugely disrespectful of them, in my view, not to do so. Obviously, fans themselves and gamers and media were talking about the anniversary, but Square themselves never mentioned about it at all, not one peep from them. And that was disappointing, not only because it was disrespectful to those that have played the game and have enjoyed the game and would have liked to have seen it recognised by Square in some way for its anniversary, but also to the game, to the franchise itself. This was a numbered entry in the franchise, of course, and it should have been recognised by Square for that, but also disrespectful to all of those people and developers that worked hard during its initial release. So Square obviously forgot about that, or they just didn't want to bring the game to the forefront of the the media or whatever the case may be. However, they did mention that the reason for the remaster was because of the game's anniversary. We'll talk about that in a moment, because that was more of an afterthought, as is clearly evident. So the Vanishing source code is the next aspect that Scott chooses to talk about here, and this is just a rumour, guys. I have searched high and low on the internet and can find no official information about this. It is a persistent rumour, one which has gone around for many years now, but it is still just that, a rumour. But according to this rumour, Square lost the source code for Final Fantasy VIII, and this is why they have not been able to do much with the game since its initial release. Now, this is the one part of the article here where I am a little bit disappointed, and I think, Scott, you should have done a bit better here. Scott says that Square Enix president and CEO Yosuke Matsuda told Game Informer that the source code for most of the company's older games has been lost. Now, for somebody that's just reading this article here, you're very, that person is very clearly going to associate this statement with Final Fantasy VIII. However, Yosuke Matsuda, when he was speaking to Game Informer, was actually speaking of the very old Square Enix catalogue, those games from the 80s, from the NES era, and had, his comment had nothing to do with the PlayStation era of games. But, Scott neglects to mention that, and in my view, that is potentially misleading, Scott. You should be doing better than that. So yeah, this is just a rumour. I don't believe, we need to give it too much attention, especially because the fact that they are now doing a remaster obviously means that if they needed the source code to do that, then they never lost it in the first place or have found it again. So next up, Scott talks about potential legal issues with the song Eyes on Me, which apparently was a potential reason as to why Square didn't release the game, or re-release the game up until recently. Now, the problem with this, first of all, again, this is just a rumour. I can't find any official information that there were legal issues with the song Eyes on Me for Square to overcome. But first of all, Square have re-released the game several times over the last few years. They haven't given those re-releases much care or attention, but they did re-release it. For example, in 2013, I think it was, they re-released the game on Steam with some gameplay enhancements, incidentally. If there were licensing issues with the song Eyes on Me that were affecting their re-release of this remake, then potentially that should have affected the re-release of the Steam version as well, which it did not. So I don't put much weight on this particular issue myself. And perhaps the most unreasonable reason, in my view, I don't want to be cynical, but maybe this is just fleshing out the article a bit more than anything, making sure it's got enough words to attract Google. I'm not saying that's it at all, but who knows. The possible remake. Well, come on guys, let's be honest. There's very little chance of there being a Final Fantasy VIII remake in development at the moment. Perhaps it's something that Square have spoken of. Perhaps it is even a project that entered initial concept stages. But I can't imagine it being any more in development or further along in development than that. Square themselves have said that many resources are being devoted to the Final Fantasy VII remake, that particular game is to be seen as the next main numbered entry in the Final Fantasy franchise, which means that we're probably not even going to be getting a Final Fantasy XVI anytime soon, and I'm certain that Final Fantasy XVI would have to be a higher priority for Square than Final Fantasy VIII remake, since Final Fantasy XV is now, several years old at this point. So I don't see any hope of Final Fantasy VIII remake being announced anytime soon. And if it was to be announced, or if it was something that Square were working on, then you'd think they'd be wanting to drum up interest in Final Fantasy VIII as a whole, as opposed to the fact that they have been neglecting it. So yeah, I don't see this as really any kind of credible reason for Final Fantasy VIII's neglect as of late at all. Anyway, guys, that's the article. Please do check it out yourself and share your thoughts in the comments below. Are you satisfied now that Square are giving Final Fantasy VIII the love it deserves with this upcoming remaster? Or do you think that Square need to be doing more and perhaps, trying to generate more interest in the game going forward? It is a Final Fantasy game, after all, at the end of the day. So surely it deserves a little bit more than what Square have been giving it. And what else would you like to see from Final Fantasy VIII going forward? Would you like to see a remake, or would you prefer Square to focus on other Final Fantasy projects instead? Yeah, thanks ever so much as well, guys, for those of you that support me on Patreon and or as a YouTube member. You guys really do help me with the channel and it means so much to me. I'll leave links to both of those in the video description for anybody else that's interested in signing up as a Patreon or YouTube member. And as always, guys, massive thank you to those who subscribe to my YouTube channel. Getting close to 30,000 subscribers now, which is a feat I never anticipated, so that's wonderful as well. But please do share your thoughts, guys. Have a fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.